Hello, and welcome to the screencast teacher seminar for question number 6 of our study guide, the progressive goal of assimilation. So we're going to read some pages in our study guide here, in the textbook, and answer these 3 questions as we go through it. Explain what allotment did to reservation land and what the U.S. government thought this would encourage American Indians to do. Explain why boarding schools were not successful. And what was a settlement house? And what kind of classes did they offer? All right, so let's get to it. All right, the progressive goal of assimilation. Many reformers believed that social problems often resulted from cultural differences among people. They thought it was important for people in the minority to assimilate and adopt the values and habits of the majority. Some of the assimilation programs that these reformers developed around the turn of the century were helpful. Other programs ended up hurting the people they were designed to help. We can see the different ways these assimilation programs affected people by looking at the experiences of 2 groups, Ojibwe, Minnesota, and European immigrants who settled in the Twin Cities. All right, the Ojibwe. By the 1900s, most American Indians, including Ojibwe in Minnesota, lived on reservations, separate from the rest of society. They had their own governments, religion, customs, and languages. They often resisted efforts by others to blend them into American society. The federal government tried to overcome this resistance by starting 2 new programs. One tried to change Native peoples' traditional relationships with the land. The other tried to force American Indian children to become more like European American children. All right, so first we'll talk about the policy of allotment. So this will be answering that first question. In 1887, the federal government passed the Dawes Act, which enacted a policy called allotment. Allotment was designed to convert American Indian reservation land, which was held in common by the whole tribe, to land owned by individuals. The policy also meant to open up land left over after allotment to European American settlers for farming and lumbering. Under allotment, reservation land was divided among members of the tribe. Each family could claim up to 160 acres, which they could then be farmed. The government thought this would encourage American Indians to become self-sufficient farmers and assimilate into American society. Those who agreed to become private landowners were granted U.S. citizenship. For many years before 1924, this was one of the only ways the Ojibwe and other American Indians could become U.S. citizens. So the way this works, guys, is they would take the land that the Native Americans had, and they would chunk it up. They would cut it up into pieces of 160 acres. So a tribal family could take 160 acres, and they could become farmers on that land. Now, once every family has a piece of land, whatever land was left over from the reservation, they lost. That went to the government, and then the government sold it to settlers. So this was a way really for the government to take even more of their land. And so that's kind of how allotment worked. And then what the government was hoping is that these families would now take this piece of land and they would become like Europeans by becoming farmers on this land. So that's really what they were hoping for. Didn't work real well. And it was basically a ploy for them to take more land. All right. In Minnesota, many Ojibwe were cheated out of their own land. Only a few of those who kept their land became self-sufficient farmers. Over the years, many Ojibwe were tricked or forced to sell their land. Eventually, European Americans owned most of the land within the boundaries of the reservations. Only the Ojibwe at the Red Lake Reservation successfully resisted the allotment policy. They kept their reservation intact and continued to hold their land in common. All right. Let's move on to what they did with the Native American children, which were the boarding schools. In 1883, several governments began requiring American Indian children, including many from Minnesota's Ojibwe reservations, to go to boarding schools. Usually, these schools were built off the reservation. Children who attended them lived away from their families and were taught to reject their people's way of life. Life at the boarding school was very different from life on the reservation. One of the first things American Indian students had to do was learn English. They had no choice. They told us they would wash our mouths out with soap if we talked in our own language, recalled one former student. American Indian children took courses in reading, writing, math, history, and geography. They also had to learn other skills European American educators considered valuable. Boys learned how to be farmers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters. Girls learned to be seamstresses, maids, and farm wives. The courses were designed to prepare American Indian children for lives off the reservation. Eventually, though, many who attended boarding schools returned to the reservation once the schooling was done. So this was the thought process, was that if we take the children away from the reservation and we make them change in these boarding schools, when they go back, they won't go back to the way that they lived, right? They'll go back and they'll be like European Americans. Okay, that was the thought. And I think it's interesting here. They say they would wash their mouth out with soap. Oftentimes, these boarding schools were much more violent than that. Many times, kids were treated very poorly and oftentimes beaten for trying to continue their ways of life. It's not really mentioned in here, so I thought I might bring that up. It was not, boarding schools were often not very kind places. Many American Indian students resisted lessons of assimilation that were teachers forced them. Some ran away, others lashed out, vandalizing or damaging school property. Many gained a new sense of the American Indian identity by meeting and becoming friends with children from other Native communities. In many cases, students' ties of their homelands became strong, too strong to be broken by boarding schools. The government eventually realized that its policy of sending American Indian children to boarding schools had not worked as planned. Instead, it started opening day schools on reservations. Most Native people preferred these schools because children returned home each day after classes. By 1910, Minnesota had more Ojibwe day schools than boarding schools. So they failed because the kids hated to be away from home, and they lashed out. Okay? They ran away, they vandalized property, and the fact that you had all of these kids in one place who all had the common enemy of the boarding school. They didn't like the boarding school. It made them gravitate towards each other and really bond together around the fact that they were all Native Americans. So it made their belief in their Native heritage even stronger. So the boarding schools did not work. All right, new immigrants. We're going to move to that last question. Immigrant communities developed in Minnesota's biggest cities during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The new immigrants often clustered in neighborhoods with people like themselves. They spoke their native languages and practiced the customs of their home countries. Some reformers worried that these new Minnesotans were not fitting in. They were not assimilating into American society quickly enough. Reformers set out to help the newcomers become full American citizens. These reformers wanted to Americanize the new immigrants. To do this, they set up programs at settlement houses, community centers where immigrants learned about life in their new country. The social workers who ran these houses organized classes in English, housekeeping, childcare, and citizenship. So a settlement house was a community center, and they taught classes on English, housekeeping, childcare, and citizenship. They also hosted festivals, folk dances, and other programs that made immigrants feel at home. The Northeast Neighborhood House in Minneapolis was one of the busiest settlement houses in Minnesota. It was located in part of the city that was home to many recent immigrants. They came from countries such as Russia, Poland, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They spoke little English. Often they were very poor. Each week, dozens of newly arrived immigrants spent time in Northeast's neighborhood house. Young children sang patriotic songs and learned a Pledge of Allegiance. Adults took English classes and studied for citizenship exams. The director of the house believed that these programs gave immigrants a clearer understanding of American conditions and ideals. This knowledge, the director believed, helped immigrants become more intelligent citizens. Unlike the Ojibwe, who were forced to assimilate, new immigrants chose whether they wanted to participate in Americanization programs as settlement houses. Some resisted giving up their native language and customs. Others welcomed the opportunity to learn about their new American way of life. Most created a life that honored both cultures. Okay. All right. So I hope that helped you guys answer the questions in your study guide for question number 6. We'll see you next time. Bye.